In the twilight of empire, when Britain's dominion stretched across oceans but its heart had begun to falter, there lived a woman who embodied both the splendor and the sorrow of that age, Edwina Mountbatten. Born into extraordinary privilege, yet drawn irresistibly toward compassion and freedom, she became one of the last bright figures of a fading world. And yet, amid the glittering halls of aristocracy and the dying embers of imperial pride, one question lingers still. What if Edwina Mountbatten had followed her heart, not her duty? Welcome, dear listeners. Whether you are hearing these words in the hush of early morning or as evening settles upon your home, I invite you to share where you listen from. Each moment connects us across time. And before we begin this journey through the corridors of memory and possibility, I gently remind you to subscribe so that together we may keep walking through the stories that might have been. There are childhoods that unfold like carefully pressed flowers, each petal preserved, each color vivid, untouched by wind or dirt. Edwina's was such a childhood. Born in 1901 into the wealthy Ashley family, granddaughter of the powerful Sir Ernest Cassell, she grew up amid the English aristocracy's final flourish, when titles still commanded reverence and fortunes still whispered of divine favor. The great houses of Broadlands and Brook House echoed with soft laughter, polished silver, and the muted rustle of servant steps. From her earliest days, Edwina was surrounded not by warmth, but by refinement. Her mother, Wilhelmina Cassell, died when Edwina was very young, leaving behind a silence that even the most opulent halls could not fill. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, loved her in the distant way of Englishmen of his time, through inheritance, not affection. And so, the little girl learned early that comfort did not always mean closeness. She roamed through the manicured gardens of Broadlands, where roses bloomed in strict order and fountains murmured with restrained elegance. Yet somewhere behind those polished gates, she sensed something missing. She had all the toys, all the lessons, all the privileges the world could offer. But she longed, somehow, for something unmeasured. There are few prisons as invisible as privilege, and fewer still as well guarded. The Edwardian world around her was steeped in hierarchy. Duty was not questioned, it was inherited, like a surname or a crest. The air itself seemed perfumed with obedience. But Edwina was restless. Beneath the lace gloves and etiquette lessons, a pulse of independence stirred. Tutors noted her impatience with formalities. Chaperones whispered that the young lady had too much curiosity for her own good. She read voraciously. Novels by Hardy and Galsworthy, journals of travel and science, even the early feminist essays that quietly circulated among educated women of her class. When the Great War broke out in 1914, she was 13, an age when the world's tragedies begin to take on shape, not abstraction. The newspapers that had once brought society gossip now arrived heavy with names of the dead. Broadland's gilded halls seemed suddenly absurd. Her father's friends, once grand figures in politics and the army, returned home broken, limping, silent. The old certainties were bleeding out across Europe, and Edwina felt, though she could not yet name it, that something within her age had cracked. She volunteered, still barely a girl, to help in war hospitals. At first, her presence was ceremonial, the daughter of a prominent family visiting wards, bringing flowers, offering the polite sympathy expected of her station. But Edwina lingered. She stayed after others left. She asked questions. She helped lift the wounded, bandaged their hands, and sat beside those who could not speak. The nurses found her awkward but earnest. And somewhere in those dim hospital corridors, she felt, perhaps for the first time, the pulse of reality unadorned by luxury. Outside, the world was remaking itself. The war had undone old social boundaries. Women were working, driving ambulances, voting. The age of empires, built on polished manners and quiet submission, had begun to waver. Edwina, standing at its threshold, looked upon that crumbling order with both fear and fascination. She loved her lineage, its grace, its culture, its music, but she also sensed that its days were numbered. In the evenings, when the house fell silent, she would sometimes sit by her window and listen to the trains in the distance. She would imagine where they were going, to towns whose names she'd never heard, to lives that existed beyond duty and decorum. The sound filled her with both envy and ache. There was a world she knew that belonged to no title, no family, no nation. And though she did not yet understand it, that world would one day call to her in a way no husband, no crown, no empire could match. When peace came in 1918, Britain celebrated, but the victory felt hollow. The great houses reopened their gates, the parties resumed, but the laughter had changed timbre. The young men who might have filled their dance cards were gone. A generation had vanished into the mud of Flanders. Edwina, now a young woman of 17, carried within her both survivor's guilt and an unspoken resolve to make her life mean something more than wealth's inheritance. In those years, she began to travel with her grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassel. He adored her, perhaps because she reminded him of the daughter he had lost, and he treated her not as a girl, but as an heir. He took her to the continent, to Paris and Vienna, where the old order of Europe was dissolving. He introduced her to statesmen, financiers, and visionaries. In his company, she glimpsed the machinery of power, its cold efficiency, and its moral vacancy. And she wondered, as only the young can, whether all this brilliance and control could ever fill the hollow left by love. When Sir Ernest died in 1921, he left Edwina one of the largest fortunes in England. The newspapers called her the richest heiress in Britain, but what she inherited that no one could name was solitude. Money, she discovered, was no shield against emptiness. Friends surrounded her, admirers courted her, but none touched her inner life. In photographs of that time, her expression is often distant, graceful, polite, but slightly elsewhere, as though her eyes were already searching for another horizon. There is something almost prophetic in that gaze, for the world she knew, the polite, self-assured, imperial world, was drawing its final breath. The 20s would roar, but beneath the jazz and champagne, something deeper stirred, a yearning for freedom, for change, for authenticity. Edwina's own heart echoed that restless rhythm. She wanted to give, to feel, to belong to something real. And so, as spring turned to summer in the year 1920, she stood once more at the gates of Broadlands, the estate she had inherited, and looked out over the rolling English countryside. The air was still, the fields golden, the river slow and certain in its path. She felt with strange certainty that her life's next chapter would not unfold here. Somewhere beyond these meadows, destiny waited, not as a crown, but as a calling. And so, as the roaring 20s beckoned with music and rebellion, Edwina stepped from the shadow of inheritance into the uncertain light of choice. The year was 1922, and the world was dressing its wounds in velvet. London shimmered again with the illusion of gaiety, the music halls alive with jazz, the parks filled with couples escaping memory, and the salons crowded with those who pretended the Great War had been a fever dream. In this fragile bloom of peace, Edwina Mountbatten, then still Edwina Ashley, was seen everywhere, elegant, reserved, and unmistakably luminous. Her wealth and grace made her the center of fascination, yet she remained curiously aloof, as though she stood a half step away from her own life. Invitations poured in, but her eyes sought not pleasure, but purpose. It was during one of these resplendent gatherings that she first encountered Lord Louis Mountbatten, a handsome young naval officer whose lineage matched hers in prestige and whose ambitions reached beyond the horizon. Louis, or Dickie, as his friends called him, was everything a young heiress might have been expected to marry. A great-grandson of Queen Victoria, nephew to the Russian Tsarina, he carried both nobility and the soft melancholy of those raised too close to power. Their courtship was brisk, formal, and slightly staged. To many, it was a perfect match. Beauty and title joined in a union that seemed designed to restore some faith in the elegance of empire. Newspapers rejoiced, the aristocracy approved, and even the royal family looked on with satisfaction. Yet within Edwina, something hesitated. She liked Louis, admired his charm and intellect, but love, real, consuming love, did not visit her heart. It was affection built on admiration, not passion, companionship promised, not yet felt. Still, duty and expectation carried their own momentum, and in July of 1922, Edwina Ashley became Lady Mountbatten. The wedding was a spectacle of precision and privilege. Westminster Abbey filled with guests who represented the remains of an age now dissolving in the fog of modernity. Photographers captured her radiant composure, her lace gown trailing behind like the echo of an era. Yet in those same photographs, if one looks closely, her eyes appear thoughtful, perhaps even unsure. She smiled for the cameras, but inside she felt the first faint tremor of what it meant to live a life designed by others. Marriage to Louis was not unkind, but it was lonely. He adored the Navy, the discipline, the adventure. She adored life itself in all its unpredictable shades. Their letters during those early years reveal a gentle dissonance, his full of timetables and ships, hers full of reflections and yearning. She wrote of books, of the people she met, of a restlessness that seemed to grow as the years passed. Their homes from Mayfair to Malta were impeccable, their manners flawless, yet there was always a sense that they performed more than they lived. To the world, they were the perfect couple, modern, poised, charitable. To themselves, they were polite strangers sharing an empire-sized house. Edwina filled her solitude with activity. She threw herself into philanthropy, supporting hospitals, orphanages, and the nascent causes of women's welfare. She traveled widely, meeting artists, intellectuals, reformers. The more she saw of the world beyond her class, the more alien her own existence seemed. She admired Louis's energy, his unyielding sense of duty, but she could not mirror it. She began to see that the empire that had shaped them both was not eternal, and its values, discipline, loyalty, restraint, were becoming shackles for a generation seeking breath. Their marriage became a partnership of convenience, though not without tenderness. Louis respected her intelligence, and perhaps sensing her inner distance, gave her a rare freedom for a woman of her station. She moved through social circles that both intrigued and scandalized the upper class, befriending writers, actors, even those of bohemian repute. Rumors whispered around her name, but Edwina seemed immune to gossip. She carried herself not in rebellion, but in quiet assertion of selfhood. It was this composure, not defiance, that most unsettled those around her. She was, in the simplest sense, alive in a way few of her peers dared to be. The late 1920s brought both wealth and weariness. Edwina became known not only for her beauty, but for her independence. Her charm drew people effortlessly, yet intimacy remained elusive. Even her husband, loyal and affectionate, seemed forever on the threshold of her deeper world. Their public life continued in perfect symmetry, grand tours, royal duties, charity galas, but beneath it all lay a shared, unspoken truth. They were bound by respect, not by fire. Louis, practical and perceptive, accepted this. He loved her in his way, and she, grateful for his decency, loved him in hers. But love, as Edwina increasingly understood, was not always enough to make two souls meet. By the decade's end, the glamour of their union had worn thin. The jazz age, with all its noise and sparkle, began to fade into something quieter, more uncertain. The world was changing again. Nations trembled between wars, economies faltered, and new voices began to question the very institutions that had once seemed eternal. Edwina, sensitive to every undercurrent, felt a strange anticipation, as though life itself were drawing her towards some vast, unseen turning point. She was not yet sure what it would be, only that it would demand everything she had once been taught to suppress: her empathy, her courage, and her heart's own will. There is an old saying that destiny begins not with thunder, but with a whisper. For Edwina, that whisper was a simple realization, dawning one winter evening as she watched the rain streak the windows of their London home. She understood that happiness could not be arranged like a table setting, that love could not be performed, that one's life, if it were to mean anything, must be chosen, not inherited. She would honor her marriage, as she always had, but she would also begin to seek something more, an existence where feeling outweighed form and sincerity triumphed over ceremony. It was in that silence between duty and desire that a different path began to whisper, faintly at first, across the years to come. The 30s arrived like a long exhalation after the fever of the previous decade, a time when the music slowed and the laughter dimmed, when the world, dressed in optimism, quietly began to tremble. In London, where the Mountbattens now resided in grand but increasingly hollow splendor, the empire still glittered on the map in crimson, yet its heart had begun to lose conviction. The colonies murmured of independence, the old families whispered of decline. The air was thick with both nostalgia and unease, and in that uneasy stillness, Edwina found herself growing restless once again. Her days were filled with the polished duties expected of a viscountess: charity luncheons, hospital boards, the endless choreography of polite society. Yet she approached each task with a seriousness that surprised her peers. Where others saw philanthropy as a pastime, she saw it as redemption. The world beyond the drawing rooms was shifting. Unemployment, hunger, the dust of depression settling over once prosperous lands, and Edwina could no longer bear to live as though insulated from it. She visited workhouses and shelters, spoke with the poor not as a benefactor but as a listener, and returned home changed each time, her fine gowns seeming heavier, her mirrors less forgiving. Louis, meanwhile, pursued his naval career with zeal. He was ambitious, precise, a man who saw life as a sequence of goals to be mastered. Their marriage, once tenderly formal, now existed on parallel tracks, his anchored in discipline, hers drifting toward discovery. They remained loyal, even affectionate, but distance had quietly colonized the space between them. They dined together, traveled together, smiled together before photographers, yet in their private silences one could sense a gulf widening, made not of anger, but of differing souls. It was around this time that Edwina's reputation began to shift in the public eye. No longer merely an heiress or a beauty, she became known as a woman of substance, a rare figure in high society who seemed to belong to no single world. She entertained royalty and radicals alike, diplomats and dreamers, her salons becoming meeting places for those who still dared to imagine a more humane world. Some admired her as a progressive spirit, others dismissed her as naive, but she did not waver. There was, within her, a growing conviction that the age of birthright was drawing to an end, and that compassion, not conquest, must define what came next. Her travels deepened this belief. In the mid-1930s, she journeyed through the Mediterranean and the Middle East, witnessing firsthand the quiet unraveling of Britain's global influence. She met women organizing schools in Cairo, doctors working in refugee camps in Greece, missionaries struggling to keep faith alive in forgotten corners of empire. Each encounter left its mark upon her, peeling away another layer of inherited detachment. She began to understand that suffering was not a distant condition, but the very soil from which new worlds were born. And though she still lived in comfort, her conscience had already crossed borders her passport could not mark. Louis tolerated her independence, sometimes proudly, sometimes uneasily. Theirs was a union now held together less by romance than by mutual respect. He admired her intelligence, even if he could not always follow its compass. In quieter moments he confessed that her courage both inspired and frightened him, that she seemed to belong not to any household, but to the horizon itself. Edwina, for her part, remained grateful for his steadiness. He was her anchor, but she no longer wished to be moored. As the decade darkened, Europe stirred restlessly again. The rise of fascism cast long shadows over the continent, and even in England the future seemed brittle. Edwina sensed the coming storm in the tightening of voices at dinner tables, the unease of diplomats at gatherings, the fear behind the newspaper headlines. War, that monstrous teacher, was returning, yet this time she felt prepared, not with resignation, but with purpose. The wounds she had tended as a girl during the Great War had left her unafraid of blood and suffering. What she dreaded was apathy, the quiet retreat of conscience in the face of power. She began volunteering again with the Red Cross, attending briefings, studying medical logistics, learning how to lead rather than simply support. Those around her were surprised. It was not expected of a viscountess to roll up her sleeves or to insist upon competence, yet Edwina had long stopped measuring herself by expectation. Her fortune, her title, her influence, these she began to see not as privileges, but as responsibilities. To use them well would be the only justification for having them at all. And yet behind this transformation, there remained the same private longing that had haunted her since youth, the search for a deeper connection, for a form of love that transcended social boundaries and spoke directly to the soul. She found fragments of it in friendship, in service, in fleeting moments of beauty, but never yet in one person. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would sit by her window and wonder whether the heart's fulfillment and duty to others could ever live in harmony. It was a question that would follow her into the next decade and into the greatest turning point of her life. By 1939, the world had returned to the brink. Europe was once again a powder keg, and the old empire trembled beneath the weight of its contradictions. In London, as sirens began to echo through the night sky, Edwina Mountbatten felt not fear, but a strange, calm resolve. She knew, as if by intuition, that the years ahead would strip away every illusion she had left, that in war's shadow she would finally discover who she truly was. The winds over empire were changing, and for Edwina they carried not despair, but the promise of transformation. For some, the coming storm meant fear. For Edwina, it meant the beginning of her true calling. When the Second Great War descended upon Europe, it did not arrive with the naive banners of glory that had accompanied the first. It came with the weary knowledge of what such darkness could do to the human spirit. For Edwina Mountbatten, now a woman of 38, it came as both a reckoning and a revelation. Gone was the fragile gaiety of interwar London. In its place rose the heavy hum of duty, sacrifice, and quiet courage. And in that grim music, Edwina found her true rhythm. From the first weeks of 1939, she committed herself wholly to relief work. While many of her peers fled to the countryside or confined themselves to fundraisers, Edwina entered the chaos directly. As a senior volunteer with the St. John Ambulance Brigade and later the British Red Cross, she oversaw the establishment of mobile field hospitals, evacuation plans, and medical supply chains that spanned continents. She visited bombed neighborhoods in London, walked among the ruins, and listened to the stories of those who had lost everything. To the astonishment of her staff, she refused to observe rank. She shared tea with nurses and porters alike, cleaned wards with her own hands, and carried messages between units when radios failed. For the first time, the barriers of class fell away completely. She was no longer the countess looking down from a balcony. She was among the people, indistinguishable in her uniform, driven by a purpose that burned far brighter than privilege. Lewis, ever the naval officer, was frequently away, commanding ships across distant seas. The war separated them in geography, but bound them in mutual respect. In his letters, he called her the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and though his tone was formal, one senses his awe. He had married a socialite. He now saw before him a leader. Their marriage, often cold in intimacy, warmed unexpectedly through distance. He admired her courage, and she, seeing his steadiness under fire, forgave his absences. They had found a new kind of partnership, one not of passion, but of parallel purpose. The war years transformed Edwina physically and spiritually. Her beauty, once the subject of endless commentary, gave way to something deeper, a kind of light behind the eyes that came from having seen too much and still chosen to care. Her hands grew rough from labor. Her voice took on the calm authority of those who have no time for pretense. Yet she was never hardened. Where others grew cynical, she remained fiercely tender, almost maternal toward the wounded and displaced. To soldiers in hospital beds, she was not a countess, but simply Lady E, the woman who listened, who remembered names, who returned when she promised she would. She traveled constantly, to France, to North Africa, to India, to the Middle East, overseeing refugee operations and medical aid. In each new place, she witnessed the full spectrum of human endurance. She saw children orphaned by bombing raids, nurses sleeping upright from exhaustion, prisoners liberated but too weak to speak. The suffering was vast, but so too was her compassion. Those who worked beside her spoke of her uncanny ability to remain serene amid horror, to find small acts of grace in the most desperate conditions. A song sung softly to a dying man, a hand laid gently on a trembling shoulder. Through it all, Edwina wrote letters. She wrote to Louis, to friends, to distant colleagues. Her words, carefully preserved, reveal a woman who no longer belonged to any single world. She wrote of the futility of conquest, the cruelty of pride, the fragile hope that flickered even in devastation. "There is no victory here," she once wrote, "only the chance to be kind." Those letters would later be quoted by younger humanitarian workers as though they were scripture. As the war dragged on, Edwina's responsibilities deepened. She was appointed Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, overseeing tens of thousands of volunteers. The task was immense, yet she approached it with characteristic modesty. Her leadership style was not one of command, but of example. She demanded from others only what she demanded of herself: endurance, compassion, and humility. It was this quiet authority that earned her universal respect. Soldiers saluted her with genuine affection, and nurses spoke her name with reverence. In 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, Edwina coordinated relief operations for what would become one of the largest humanitarian mobilizations in modern history. She worked night and day, often without rest, ensuring that hospitals, supplies, and volunteers were ready for the flood of casualties to come. When victory finally came in 1945, she did not celebrate. Instead, she traveled to the bombed ruins of Germany to inspect the care of prisoners and displaced families. She described it later as walking through the debris of civilization itself. And yet, even there, she found moments of tenderness, the smile of a child receiving food, the brief laughter between strangers who had survived. By war's end, Edwina Mountbatten had changed beyond recognition. The woman who had once been the darling of society had become something rarer, a servant of humanity. The press now wrote of her not as an ornament of empire, but as its conscience. She received honors from several nations, yet she accepted them with quiet reluctance. What mattered to her was not the recognition, but the work unfinished, the millions still hungry, the nations still bleeding. She felt an urgency she could not explain, as though her life's purpose were not yet complete, as though history itself were steering her toward one final test. In those quiet months after the victory parades, when Britain tried to remember what peace felt like, Edwina returned briefly to Broadlands. The estate was as beautiful as ever, the lawns precise, the river serene, but she could no longer see it as home. Its silence, once comforting, now seemed sterile. She found herself drawn to the world beyond England's shores, to lands where need still called her name. She sensed that her journey of compassion had only begun, and that the next chapter would ask not only for her strength, but for her heart. And when the guns finally fell silent, she emerged not merely as a countess, but as a woman reborn by compassion. The war had ended, but peace did not return easily. Across the world, the old empires stirred like weary giants waking from a fever, uncertain of their place in the dawn. Britain, exhausted and impoverished, began to feel the strain of its dominion slipping away. Yet even amid rationing and ruin, the machinery of empire still turned, and at its center, fate began to shape a path that would draw Edwina Mountbatten far from the calm meadows of Hampshire into the beating heart of a nation about to be reborn. In early 1947, Louis Mountbatten was appointed Viceroy of India, the last man to hold that ancient burden title. His task was monumental: to oversee Britain's withdrawal from the jewel of its empire, to hand over power with dignity before the cracks of partition tore the subcontinent apart. When Edwina heard the news, she felt something stir within her, not fear, but recognition, as though a summons had been delivered to her soul. India, with all its contradictions of suffering and beauty, was the one place that might match the immensity of her restless compassion. She would not accompany her husband merely as decoration or consort. She would go, as she told a friend, to serve where humanity needs gentleness most. When their ship approached Bombay that spring, the air was dense with heat, spice, and expectation. From the deck, Edwina watched the shoreline shimmer, a mosaic of domes, minarets, and colonial facades beneath a sky of impossible light. The crowds that gathered to greet them were vast, their cheers tinged with both reverence and resentment. To many Indians, she and Louis represented the final shadow of foreign rule. To others, they were bearers of transition, the bridge between oppression and freedom. As she stepped ashore, the scent of jasmine and dust mingled with the salt of the sea. It was the first time in her life she felt utterly humbled by a place. Within weeks, she began her work. While Louis wrestled with political negotiations in Delhi, Edwina threw herself into humanitarian service on a scale she had never known. She toured hospitals, refugee camps, and villages scarred by famine and disease. She moved among the poor without hesitation, listening, learning, comforting. Her open manner startled officials accustomed to distance and ceremony. Indian nurses and aid workers spoke of her as the English woman who truly sees us, and perhaps she did, for Edwina's eyes had long learned to look beyond appearances. She saw the grief beneath the grandeur, the resilience in the dust. India in 1947 was a country poised on the edge of both freedom and tragedy. The partition between India and Pakistan loomed, dividing not only land but families, languages, and faiths. Violence simmered in the air, invisible yet omnipresent, like a storm that refused to break. Edwina moved through this tension with quiet purpose. In Calcutta, she visited relief centers where thousands of refugees huddled amid disease and hunger. In Punjab, she comforted women who had lost their children to communal riots. Wherever she went, she was accompanied by the soft murmurs of gratitude, disbelief, and admiration. It was said that even the angriest critics of British rule found it difficult to despise her. She carried within her something that transcended politics, a sincerity too rare in the machinery of empire. It was during these harrowing months that she first met Jawaharlal Nehru, India's future prime minister, already a man both revered and misunderstood. Their first meeting was formal, in the gardens of the Viceroy's house. She in her linen dress, he in his austere sherwani, each aware of the delicate stage upon which history had placed them. Yet from that first conversation, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition, as if two weary souls had found their reflection. Nehru, intellectual and idealistic, carried the loneliness of a man devoted to ideals larger than himself. Edwina, compassionate and courageous, bore the solitude of a woman who had given everything but never been seen for who she was. Between them, there was no flirtation, only an understanding that defied explanation. Over the months, their encounters multiplied, initially under the pretext of official meetings, later through letters and long, reflective walks. They discussed politics, literature, and the future of a divided world. Yet beneath those conversations ran a current of tenderness, subtle but undeniable. To Nehru, she represented a gentleness long denied by the harshness of leadership. To Edwina, he embodied the humanity and intellect she had always sought but never found in her own world. It was not the infatuation of youth, but the meeting of two mature spirits who had suffered and still believed in grace. Their connection did not go unnoticed. Courtiers whispered, journalists speculated, and even Louis, wise, perceptive, and more complex than he appeared, sensed the growing bond. Yet rather than outrage, he met it with quiet acceptance. He once wrote that Edwina's friendship with Nehru did not take anything from me. It gave her the peace she had sought all her life. It was perhaps the most generous act of understanding one could offer in an age built on pride. Through it all, Edwina continued her humanitarian mission with unflagging energy. She visited camps along the border where trains arrived daily, each one bearing hundreds of bodies, victims of Partition's madness. She wept openly, yet refused to despair. She worked with both Indian and British medical staff, urging them to treat everyone alike. Her presence alone calmed chaos. Her voice, steady and low, carried authority born not from rank, but from compassion. To those around her, she became a symbol of reconciliation, a bridge not only between two nations, but between two visions of humanity, one defined by control, the other by love. By the autumn of 1947, India stood free but broken. Flags changed, maps were redrawn, and millions mourned what could never be restored. Yet amid the ruin, there remained the faint glow of connection. Between Edwina and Nehru, between service and affection, between loss and hope. The world would never fully comprehend their bond, but perhaps that was as it should be. Some relationships are too delicate for the language of history, and as the season turned, as Delhi's air grew cooler and the Viceroy's house began to empty of its British occupants, Edwina lingered in the garden one evening, watching the lamps of the city flicker in the distance. Somewhere beyond that horizon, she knew, lay a choice between the life of duty she had always lived and the life of feeling she had always longed for. The night was still, the scent of jasmine heavy, the sound of distant prayer weaving through the air. And in that quiet moment, she understood that love, like empire, was never meant to last forever, but its echo could reshape the world. And in that single exchange, something unspoken stirred. A bridge between empires, built not of power, but of recognition. The summer of 1947 unfurled like a tapestry, both radiant and torn. Across the Indian subcontinent, independence had arrived, triumphant, painful, irreversible. Flags were raised, borders drawn, destinies rewritten in fire and blood. Edwina Mountbatten moved through it all like a figure of calm amid storm, her white saris streaked with dust, her hands never still. She comforted mothers in refugee camps, wrote tirelessly to coordinate food shipments, soothed frightened children with words that transcended language. But behind that ceaseless compassion, something deeper was stirring. A quiet defiance, a recognition that the life she had once promised herself to could no longer contain the truth of her heart. It was in those months of chaos that Edwina's bond with Jawaharlal Nehru deepened into something neither of them could deny nor define. They met often, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by longing. Their conversations drifted from politics to poetry, from the logistics of relief to reflections on fate. Nehru, burdened by the birth of a new nation and the ghosts of partition, found in her a rare serenity. She listened without judgment, offered solace without condition. She saw not the statesman, but the man, a weary idealist who loved his country with the same selfless devotion she had once given to her causes. And in his gaze she found the recognition she had sought all her life, not as an ornament of empire, but as a soul capable of love, grief, and transformation. Their friendship, though publicly discreet, became an open secret. Courtiers spoke in murmurs, and the press speculated with a mixture of scandal and fascination. Yet to those who saw them together, the truth was evident. Theirs was not an affair of bodies, but of spirits. When they walked in the Mughal gardens of Delhi, their steps slow beneath the jacaranda trees, there was between them a silence more eloquent than speech. In that silence, Edwina rediscovered the youth she had never truly lived, the joy of being seen without pretense, of belonging to another without possession. Louis Mountbatten, ever pragmatic, understood more than he admitted. He admired Nehru and respected the affection that had grown between them. In private, he told friends that Edwina had finally found a kind of peace. Perhaps he, too, felt a strange liberation in that acceptance. After years of mutual restraint, he had learned that love, in its truest form, cannot be caged by convention. Theirs became a triangle not of jealousy, but of mutual respect, a configuration almost unthinkable in their time. Yet for Edwina, this quiet rebellion was not without cost. Each day she lived torn between two worlds, the decorum of British expectation and the freedom of her heart's awakening. Letters from London reminded her of her duties, her social standing, her husband's reputation. But each morning in Delhi, the sight of India, its chaos, its beauty, its unrelenting humanity, called her elsewhere. She felt, as she later confided to a friend, a strange guilt for finding joy in a land drowning in sorrow. Yet that very sorrow was what made the joy sacred. By the autumn of that same year, her choice had begun to take shape, not through proclamation, but through quiet persistence. When the Mountbattens' term as viceroy and vicereine drew to its close, Louis prepared to return to England, his mission complete. Edwina, however, hesitated. The thought of leaving India and Nehru filled her with an ache she could not disguise. The land had become more than a posting, it had become her truth. Each morning she walked through the gardens of the Viceroy's house, now soon to be renamed the Rashtrapati Bhavan, and felt the air thick with memory. The voices of the poor she had served, the faces of the women she had comforted, the gentle dignity of Nehru, all had entwined themselves around her heart like the roots of a sacred tree. One evening, under a sky thick with monsoon clouds, she stood on the terrace of that vast palace and made her decision. She would stay, not as a British official's wife, but as herself, a woman free at last to follow what she knew to be right. History would judge her, society would not forgive her, but she could no longer live divided. She would serve India, not England, compassion, not convention, love, not duty. Louis received her decision with quiet grace. There was pain in his eyes, but not bitterness. He understood that what bound them now was affection, not obligation. "You were never mine to keep," he told her softly before he sailed for England. "You belong to the world that needs you most." Those words, spoken without accusation, would stay with her forever. When news of her decision reached Britain, it caused a tremor of disbelief. The newspapers called it betrayal. Some dubbed it madness. How could the vicereine of India, an icon of English nobility, choose to remain in the land she was meant to relinquish? Yet for Edwina, there was no madness in it at all. She had merely ceased pretending that duty and conscience were the same. Her new life began without ceremony. She took up residence in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of Delhi, near the hospital she had helped establish. There, among the smell of dust and jasmine, she found a strange, profound peace. Nehru visited often, sometimes to discuss relief work, sometimes simply to share a quiet meal. Their companionship was now stripped of politics and formality. It was the meeting of two weary hearts that had nothing left to prove. At dusk, they would sit on the veranda, listening to the slow breath of the city, speaking little. The silence between them was not absence but completion. And so, While the world around her debated the future of nations, Edwina Mountbatten chose to live her own revolution. Not through conquest or protest, but through presence. She became a symbol of something larger than any empire, the triumph of compassion over convention, of humanity over pride. Her choice scandalized some and inspired others, but to those who knew her, it was the most natural act she could have performed. She had simply followed her heart, and in doing so, she had stepped beyond history's narrow expectations of women, of love, and of empire itself. It was not rebellion that moved her, but a gentler defiance, the choice to follow her heart into history's fire. In the early months of 1948, Delhi breathed a tense, uncertain air. Independence had been won, yet peace was fragile, partition wounds still raw, and every conversation carried an undertone of exhaustion. Amid that uneasy dawn, the figure of Edwina Mountbatten became both a mystery and a magnet for curiosity. The British press, still smarting from the loss of empire, reported her continued presence in India with barely concealed outrage. They called it reckless, sentimental, even treacherous. Letters arrived from old friends in London pleading for her to come home, to resume her rightful place among her kind. But she was already home, in this land of dust and light, where her heart no longer asked permission to exist. She had moved into a modest compound near the Yamuna River, her days consumed by the grim work of rehabilitation. The partition had torn through the subcontinent like a fever, millions displaced, countless families separated by hastily drawn lines. Edwina coordinated convoys of food and medicine between Delhi, Lahore, and Karachi, refusing to take sides in a conflict that had no true boundary. Her small office, furnished only with a desk, a fan, and a fading photograph of her daughters, became a crossroads of desperation and hope. Indian officials, British officers, Sikh and Muslim community leaders all came to her seeking assistance. She gave what she could: resources, encouragement, and the calm certainty that kindness, even when exhausted, must not falter. Through all this, Jawaharlal Nehru remained a constant presence. He visited her often, sometimes late in the evening, when the heat finally relented and the cicadas began their song. They would sit outside under the neem trees, a small lamp between them, its flame wavering in the night breeze. Their conversations ranged from politics to poetry, from the grief of their people to the faint possibilities of redemption. When he spoke of the India he dreamed of, secular, just, awake, her eyes would soften with admiration, and when she spoke of the human cost of freedom, his own voice would lower to a whisper, as though the pain itself demanded reverence. Between them, the boundaries of formality dissolved completely. He no longer called her Lady Mountbatten, but simply Edwina. She, in turn, addressed him not as the Prime Minister, but as Panditji, a word that carried affection as much as respect. Their companionship became a quiet ritual woven into the rhythm of Delhi life. To the people who worked around them, it was not scandalous, only extraordinary. The British noblewoman and the Indian leader, bound not by politics or possession, but by the mutual recognition of souls who had finally found rest in each other's presence. Of course, the outside world saw it differently. In the British clubs that lingered like ghosts across the former Raj, her name was whispered over gin and bitterness. In drawing rooms in Hampshire and London, her decision to remain in India was dissected as though it were an illness. She's gone native, they said, or Nehru has bewitched her. The tabloids published photographs of them together at relief camps, their expressions earnest, their proximity gentle but unmistakable. Yet no accusation could fully touch her. She neither denied nor explained. To friends who asked why she stayed, she would smile faintly and reply, "Because there is still work to be done." Louis, back in England, bore the gossip with stoic grace. His public face was one of unwavering loyalty, even pride. In private letters, he defended Edwina fiercely, insisting that her compassion was not a betrayal, but an extension of the very ideals Britain claimed to uphold. When they spoke by telephone, rare, expensive calls that carried both warmth and melancholy, he told her that the world would eventually understand. "You are doing what we all ought to have done," he said once, "serving not the empire, but humanity." Meanwhile, in India, the year's events moved with tragic urgency. In January, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated and the nation fell into mourning. Edwina was among the first to reach Nehru when the news arrived, finding him pale and trembling in the corridors of his residence. The grief that consumed him seemed bottomless, and she remained by his side as he prepared to speak to the people. That night, after his famous address, "The light has gone out of our lives," he sat in silence for hours, and she stayed beside him without words. Later, he told her that her presence alone had kept him from breaking. It was a moment neither of them ever spoke of again, but it bound them irrevocably. As the months passed, the scandal the British imagined failed to materialize. In India, Edwina was not despised, but revered. Her courage, her tenderness, her refusal to abandon the land she had once served as vicereine, all endeared her to the people. Newspapers wrote of her visits to orphanages and hospitals, describing her not as a relic of colonialism, but as a symbol of reconciliation. Even those who had fought for independence acknowledged her sincerity. She became, in an irony history could not ignore, more beloved in India than she had ever been in England. In the quiet of her evenings, she sometimes pondered the strange symmetry of it all. She had spent her youth imprisoned by expectation, her adulthood liberated by service, and now, in the autumn of her life, she found freedom in love. Yet it was not a love that demanded possession or even expression. It was simply there, like breath, like sunlight, like the faint fragrance of flowers that bloom unseen. Nehru, too, seemed to draw strength from it. His burdens were immense, his isolation profound, yet whenever he looked into her calm, steadfast eyes, he found the reassurance that kindness could survive even power. And so the world's scandal became, in time, its quietest grace. Two nations that had once stood in opposition saw in their friendship a reflection of what might have been, a gentler end to empire, a bridge built not by treaties, but by trust. Edwina's presence softened what could have been bitterness. Her compassion lent dignity to the awkward transition of history. She no longer belonged to England or to India, but to the space between them, a living symbol of reconciliation. And so, the Countess became a symbol of a new kind of union, neither political nor romantic, but profoundly human. The years that followed the tumult of independence were quieter on the surface, but beneath that calm lay the slow, delicate labor of rebuilding a country. And, for Edwina Mountbatten, of reshaping a life. India was breathing again, but each breath carried the ache of partition, the memory of what had been lost. Cities were mending themselves, families were finding new homes, and a generation of leaders was learning how to govern not by decree, but by hope. Edwina moved within this world not as an outsider, nor quite as one of its own, but as something rarer, a bridge between the wounds of the past and the possibilities of the future. In Delhi, she lived simply, in a modest whitewashed bungalow surrounded by flowering gulmohar trees. The air in her home was heavy with the scent of marigold garlands brought each morning by local children, who had long ceased to be afraid of the tall Englishwoman with kind eyes and practical shoes. The walls were lined not with portraits of ancestors, but with maps, letters, and photographs from her travels across India's villages. Images of faces that spoke more powerfully than any ceremony could. She had become, almost inadvertently, an emblem of service, a woman who had once represented the authority of empire, now carrying water for those the empire had ignored. Jawaharlal Nehru visited often. Their meetings, though always discreet, became a fixture of Delhi's rhythm. Sometimes they would sit together in the gardens of Teen Murti House, beneath the ancient peepal trees, whose branches swayed like slow dancers in the afternoon heat. He would read her fragments of Tagore or Ghalib, verses that seemed to hover in the air between them like unspoken confessions. She listened in silence, her expression soft with understanding, and when she spoke, it was never to analyze or to console, but simply to remind him that even burdened hearts could rest for a while. To those who watched from a distance, their bond seemed to defy the very categories by which society tried to define love. It was neither illicit nor official, neither wholly public nor secret. It was, in the truest sense, human. Together, they began to channel their connection into work. India in those years was desperate for organization, for compassion turned into structure. Edwina assisted in the establishment of new nursing schools, hospitals, and refugee settlements, often under Nehru's quiet encouragement. He trusted her completely, knowing that her compassion was matched by efficiency. When foreign relief agencies hesitated to send aid, she wrote to them directly, invoking not pity, but partnership. Her letters carried the weight of sincerity. Her reputation for integrity was such that governments and charities responded with unusual speed. The Indian people, still uncertain about their new nation's place in the world, began to see in her a curious symbol of reassurance. She had once been the vicereine, the face of imperial power, yet she had renounced comfort and title to stay among them. This act, unpublicized but deeply felt, touched something in their collective conscience. Women admired her courage. Men respected her restraint. She moved through crowds without guards, spoke with laborers without condescension, and when she bowed before grieving mothers, even the skeptical could not accuse her of artifice. The British press, by then weary of its own decline, continued to print speculation. There were editorials questioning her sanity, insinuations about her motives, and endless rehashings of her connection with Nehru. Yet, as the months passed, their words lost power. Scandal, when confronted by quiet dignity, eventually exhausts itself, and Edwina, unflinching, gave them nothing to feed upon. When asked by a visiting journalist whether she regretted remaining in India, she answered with characteristic simplicity, "When one has seen so much suffering, one does not ask where one belongs. One asks only how one may still be useful." Her relationship with Nehru, now deepened by routine and understanding, continued to evolve in the gentle manner of things that need no definition. They wrote to each other constantly, letters that wove together the personal and the political, filled with news of their work, musings on art, and reflections on solitude. His handwriting was precise, her responses full of warmth and subtle humor. These letters, preserved in archives and private collections, reveal not the fever of forbidden love, but the serenity of two souls who had outgrown fear. When he wrote of his loneliness, she reminded him that solitude was the natural companion of those who lead. When she wrote of fatigue, he urged her to rest, though both knew she never would. There were times when they traveled together, officially to inspect relief projects, unofficially to steal a few quiet days away from the demands of statehood. In Kashmir, they stayed briefly by Dal Lake, where the water mirrored the snow-capped Himalayas and where the silence was so complete that it felt like a benediction. They would walk along the shore, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes a few steps apart, speaking little. The beauty around them seemed to dissolve the boundaries between past and present, between two people and the vastness that held them. For Edwina, those days became a kind of memory before the moment had even passed, a fragile eternity carved out of borrowed time. Back in Delhi, their partnership began to take on a symbolic dimension. In the eyes of India and the world, they embodied a reconciliation that transcended politics. The former colonizer and the newly independent leader, united not by treaty, but by tenderness. Foreign dignitaries who visited Nehru's residence would sometimes find her there, discussing famine relief or refugee education as if she were part of his cabinet. Yet she sought no recognition, and when thanked publicly, she deflected the praise toward others. Her humility disarmed even her critics. It was during this period that Nehru confided to a colleague, "She gives me the one thing no one else can, rest." For a man who carried the weight of a nation's future, that was no small gift. And for Edwina, whose life had long been spent giving, it was perhaps the first time she received something in return. Understanding without demand, affection without condition. Their connection, though tender, was never escapist. They were too aware of the suffering around them to retreat into the luxury of private joy. Instead, their love became a form of labor, an act of hope performed daily against despair. It showed in the efficiency of relief work, in the patience with which they met each crisis, in the calm that seemed to emanate from them when they appeared together. Those who witnessed it could not help but sense that something larger than romance was unfolding, a union that belonged less to two individuals than to the shared dream of two nations learning to forgive each other. And so, as the first years of India's independence gave way to the next, Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru stood as living proof that empathy could bridge even the deepest divides. The world around them continued to judge, to speculate, to label. But within that world, they had carved out a sanctuary of truth, where love required neither explanation nor apology. Together, they began to prove that love, when freed from possession, can become a force of creation. By the dawn of the new decade, Delhi had begun to find its rhythm, half hopeful, half weary. The nation was building itself brick by brick, its bureaucracy swelling, its dreams often outrunning its resources. Edwina Mountbatten moved through this landscape as though suspended between two realities. In the bright mornings, she visited hospitals and nursing schools she had helped to establish, her linen saris immaculate, her steps brisk despite the heat. By evening, she sat quietly with Jawaharlal Nehru in his study at Teen Murty House, reading reports by the pale lamplight, their silence companionable, the air heavy with unspoken tenderness. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the world around them was tightening with the invisible pressures of power. The Indian press had begun to change. Where once it had written of Edwina with admiration and gratitude, it now grew restless, probing, political. The age of reverence was ending. The age of scrutiny had begun. Columnists wondered whether her continued presence near the Prime Minister blurred the line between friendship and influence. Some accused Nehru of sentimentality, of being too soft-hearted toward the vestiges of empire. Others suggested that her philanthropy masked interference. The truth, as always, was quieter and more complicated. Edwina had never sought power, and Nehru, despite his affection for her, was too disciplined to yield his judgment to anyone. Yet in the court of perception, reason seldom prevails. Gossip travels faster than grace. Edwina felt the sting of these rumors more deeply than she admitted. She had lived long enough to endure whispers, but this time the cruelty cut closer. She had given everything to this country, her comfort, her reputation, her standing in England, and still it was not enough. "I am," she wrote in one of her letters to a friend, "neither wholly theirs nor wholly yours. I am adrift between worlds, and perhaps that is where I was meant to remain." She continued her work as before, but the fatigue that now shadowed her days was not only physical, it was the exhaustion of a heart that had stretched itself too far across human need. Nehru, too, began to feel the weight of public judgment. His cabinet, once united by the euphoria of independence, was fracturing under ideological strain. He faced criticism from both left and right, accused of being too idealistic, too Western, too enamored of the very civility the revolution had overthrown. He bore it all with his characteristic dignity, but Edwina could see the toll it took, the sleepless nights, the lines deepening around his eyes, the quiet tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. She worried for him in ways that went beyond friendship. When she saw him falter, she would reach across the table, touch his hand for a brief second, and whisper, "You must rest, Panditji." And he would smile, weary but grateful, and reply, "Not while the world still waits to be mended." The pressure surrounding them began to manifest in small human ways. There were fewer walks in the garden now, fewer unhurried evenings. Their conversations grew heavier, edged with the awareness that their companionship, so effortless in its beginning, had become a subject of calculation for others. Yet even as the political storms gathered, their private understanding only deepened. Each saw in the other a mirror of endurance. She, a woman who had stepped out of the boundaries of her own civilization. He, a man who bore upon his shoulders the expectations of 500 million souls. They shared not only affection, but fatigue, a longing for the simple peace neither could afford. By the winter of 1951, Edwina's health began to falter. Years of travel, heat, and ceaseless labor had begun to erode the strength that once carried her through battlefields and refugee camps. Her doctors advised rest, even a return to England, but she refused. "My work is here," she told them, "and my heart too." Nehru urged her gently to reconsider, but he knew persuasion was useless. To Edwina, departure would have felt like betrayal, not of him, but of the countless lives she had promised to serve. And so she pressed on, her will more steadfast than her body. At public functions, her figure grew thinner, her face more drawn. Yet when she entered a room, conversations still paused. When she spoke, even cynics listened. There was something indomitable in her stillness, something that no illness could diminish. She continued to travel across the country, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, inspecting clinics, comforting nurses, sharing meals with orphans who barely knew her name, but felt her kindness as surely as sunlight. Wherever she went, people bowed not to her title, but to her sincerity. Yet at night, in the quiet of her small Delhi home, she sometimes sat awake by the open window, listening to the hum of the city. From the distance came the faint echo of temple bells and the murmur of voices in the bazaar. She thought of the England she had left behind, its cold mornings, its clipped courtesies, its familiar restraint, and realized that she no longer belonged to it. She had been transformed by the rawness of India, by its unvarnished humanity, by the uncontainable love she had found in its dust and chaos. And yet she also knew that her presence here had become a burden for the man she loved, giving ammunition to his enemies. It was a cruel paradox. The very connection that had humanized him in the eyes of millions now threatened to undermine his standing among his peers. Still, she stayed. To leave would have been to yield to fear, and fear was a language she had never spoken. Instead, she retreated slightly from the public gaze, allowing her work to speak in her stead. She devoted herself to women's health initiatives, to training programs for nurses in rural regions, to small acts of repair invisible to politics but essential to life. Each morning she rose with the first light, her movement slower now but her spirit unbroken. And when Nehru visited, sometimes unannounced, slipping through the back gate to avoid reporters, she would greet him with a tired smile, pour him tea, and ask, "Tell me, what new troubles have you invited today?" He would laugh softly, and for a few moments the burdens of their separate worlds would dissolve into shared quiet. But even love, however pure, cannot remain untouched by time. The world around them grew harsher, less forgiving. New alliances formed, new rivalries took shape. The warmth that had once enveloped their friendship was now shadowed by scrutiny. Theirs had been a miracle of understanding between nations once divided by empire. But miracles, as history teaches, cannot be sustained forever in the daylight of politics. And in the quiet of Delhi nights, the same question returned again and again. Had love changed the world, or merely exposed its limits. There are moments in a life, and in history, when time itself seems to pause, when, after years of turbulence and pain, the air softens, the light mellows, and even the weary heart finds brief refuge. For Edwina and Jawaharlal, the years between 1953 and 1955 were such a time. The storms of partition had quieted, the clamor of scandal had dulled into the low hum of acceptance. India had begun to steady its footing, and the world, watching from afar, was learning to see in its prime minister not merely a statesman, but a symbol of renewal. And beside him, never far from view, was Edwina, quieter now, more fragile, yet suffused with that inward radiance that comes only to those who have long stopped seeking validation. Delhi in those years had a gentler rhythm. The gardens of Teen Murti House bloomed with bougainvillea, and the city's dusty avenues shimmered beneath the golden haze of evening. On Sundays, Nehru would sometimes escape the suffocating order of official life and drive with Edwina toward the foothills of the Himalayas. The road was long, the villages sparse, the air growing cooler as the plains gave way to winding passes. At the roadside, children would wave, not recognizing the famous faces behind the open car windows, only sensing kindness in the way the woman smiled at them. At the end of such journeys lay stillness, perhaps a government bungalow in Kasauli, perhaps a borrowed house near Nainital. And there, for a few days, they allowed themselves to be almost ordinary. Those who were close to them in those years spoke of their companionship with a kind of reverence. It was no longer the fragile secret of their early acquaintance, nor the scandal of whispered gossip. It had become something serene, accepted, even inevitable. They moved together with the familiarity of people who no longer needed words. At breakfast, they read in silence, exchanging brief glances over the morning paper. In the evenings, they walked among the pines or sat by a window, watching the play of light over the hills. There was no need for grand declarations. Love had settled into the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, something so constant it ceased to announce itself. For Nehru, these respites were salvation. The responsibilities of leadership had grown crushing. Every day brought new challenges, border tensions, economic strain, the unending task of forging unity in a land vast enough to contain multitudes of faith and language. The solitude of power, that ancient affliction of rulers, pressed heavily upon him. But in Edwina's company, that solitude loosened its grip. Her presence restored to him what politics had long taken, humanity unmasked by duty. She listened to his doubts without judging, laughed at his rare flashes of humor, and reminded him, gently but firmly, that greatness could coexist with tenderness. For Edwina, too, these years were a kind of grace. Her health was failing, her heart sometimes unsteady, her strength easily spent, but she did not yield to fragility. Each morning she continued to work, reviewing reports from the Red Cross, advising nursing schools, organizing shipments of medicine for flood-stricken provinces. She often joked that she had become India's most determined volunteer, but the truth was that she needed this work as much as it needed her. It anchored her in purpose, warded off the melancholy that often followed her in moments of rest. And when exhaustion overtook her, she would sit quietly on the veranda, a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes distant yet peaceful, watching the golden dust swirl through the sunlight. The bond between her and Nehru deepened precisely because they both understood its impermanence. They never sought to define or secure it. They knew that to do so would diminish its grace. Theirs was not a story of possession, but of presence. It existed within the fragile, luminous boundaries of time itself, one that both cherished and respected its eventual end. When he wrote to her, his letters were never desperate, only grateful. "You have become," he told her once, "the still point in a turning world." And she, with characteristic understatement, replied, "Then let us both remain still a little longer." Those who visited them during this period would sometimes find them in quiet conversation at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of rain. They spoke of books, of history, of the strange loops of destiny that had brought them together. Nehru confessed his recurring dream, that of a house by a river, simple and unguarded, where they could grow old in peace. Edwina smiled, knowing such a dream was not for them, yet cherishing it nonetheless. "We were never meant for still waters," she said once. "We were meant for currents." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Then we shall drift together as long as the river allows." That river, the metaphor of all things passing, seemed to shadow their days. Both sensed, though neither said aloud, that their time was finite. Her heart condition worsened, his political burdens multiplied. The tender interlude they shared was not a retreat from the world, but a sanctuary carved within it, fleeting yet eternal in its impression. In the rare moments they disagreed, perhaps over policy, perhaps over fatigue, they did so with the gentleness of people who understood that every word might be their last. When she returned to England briefly in 1954 for medical consultation, the separation felt heavier than before. Nehru wrote to her almost daily, his letters filled not with longing but with quiet care. He sent her Indian newspapers, pressed flowers, small tokens of the life they had shared. She replied from her bedside in London, assuring him that she would soon return, though she knew each journey back across the sea grew harder. The doctors warned her against travel, but she dismissed them. "I cannot end my days among gray skies," she said. "My heart belongs where the light is warmest." And so she returned once more, against advice, stepping into the heavy Delhi heat with the same determination that had once carried her through the rubble of war. When Nehru saw her again, paler, slower, but still luminous, he took her hand and whispered, "You've come home." She smiled, and for a moment all the years between them seemed to vanish. It was as if history itself had paused to allow two souls a final measure of peace before time reclaimed them. Their last months together unfolded in quiet symmetry. She no longer attended official functions. Instead, she devoted herself to her hospitals and her correspondence. He continued to lead his government with that delicate blend of intellect and exhaustion that had come to define him. And in the evenings when they met, the world's noise receded. They spoke of the sea, of books they loved, of the strange, beautiful pain of belonging to two worlds. There was no bitterness in her voice now, only acceptance. "All things pass," she said one evening, "but love, I think, only changes form." Even the brightest summers must bend toward autumn, and in her frailty Edwina discovered the gentlest truth of all, that love, too, must let go. By the mid-1950s, the rhythm of Edwina's life had slowed to the gentle pace of one who knows that every remaining day must be savored like a final page in a much-loved book. The years of tireless travel, the fevered urgency of service, the weight of unending compassion, all had left their mark upon her body. Her heart, always fragile, now protested the strain. The physician spoke in grave tones, urging her to rest, to relinquish the endless journeying that had defined her. But Edwina, whose spirit had never bowed to fear or fatigue, refused to yield to stillness entirely. She would rest, yes, but not retreat. Her life, she believed, belonged to the world until the very last breath. She divided her time now between India and England, though the word home no longer truly applied to either. In London, she felt like a visitor among ghosts, the laughter of society parties hollow, the chatter of friends trivial after the searing intimacy of India's sorrows. Her daughters, now grown, loved her fiercely but distantly. They had long accepted that their mother was a woman claimed by causes larger than any family could hold. When she visited Broadlands, the vast lawns and echoing corridors seemed strangely diminished, as if the house itself understood that her heart no longer belonged to it. She would walk through its rooms in silence, pausing before portraits of ancestors who had lived by duty, not by love, and feel at once grateful and estranged. "I am the product of their world," she confided in a letter, "and yet I have undone it by living." India, though equally changed, still felt like hers. Each return brought an ache of belonging that no passport could explain. The air itself seemed to welcome her, heavy with the scent of earth after rain, alive with color and sound. Wherever she went, Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, she was greeted not as an outsider, but as a friend of the people. Children ran to her car, women bowed with hands folded, men nodded with quiet respect. She had ceased to be the emblem of a bygone empire. She was now simply Lady Edwina, the woman who stayed, the one who listened, the one who never forgot. Nehru, too, had changed in these years. The exuberance of the young republic had faded into the melancholy of governance. He had aged visibly, his hair now more silver than black, his eyes shadowed by the endless compromises demanded of a leader. Yet his affection for Edwina remained a constant light in the twilight of his life. When she returned to India after months away, his letters would shorten. When she was near, his days seemed lighter. They saw each other often, but their meetings had grown quieter, more contemplative. The laughter that once danced between them was now replaced by the silence of deep knowing. They spoke little of politics, even less of their own health. Instead, they spoke of books, of rivers, of the way memories soften when told aloud. It was during one of these visits that Edwina confided her wish to spend her final days in India. The doctors had warned her that travel was dangerous, but she could not imagine dying anywhere else. "I was born among privilege," she said softly, "but I was reborn among the poor. I cannot leave my second home unfinished." Nehru listened without protest. He had long since learned that she was a woman who could not be persuaded away from conviction. Yet her words pierced him, leaving behind a silent dread he carried in the privacy of his heart. Her final journey across India was both farewell and pilgrimage. She visited the hospitals she had helped build, the refugee colonies that still bore traces of her care. At each stop, people gathered to greet her, unaware perhaps that this would be the last time they would see her. In Calcutta, she spoke to a group of nurses about the sacredness of compassion. In Madras, she stood by the sea, the wind lifting her scarf, and closed her eyes to the sound of waves. Her health was failing rapidly, fatigue clinging to her like shadow, but she bore it with the same quiet composure that had defined her life. When she returned to Delhi for the last time, she stayed at a small government guest house near the river. The city was softer now, its winter light gentle, its nights cool and fragrant. Nehru visited her there often, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes simply sitting beside her bed in silence. They did not speak of the end. To do so would have broken the fragile grace that sustained them. Instead, they reminisced about the years behind them, the war, the relief work, the gardens, the letters. He told her that she had changed his understanding of love, that she had taught him the quiet courage of gentleness. She smiled faintly, her hand resting on his. "You gave me purpose," she whispered, "and in return, I gave you peace. It was a fair exchange." In her final weeks, she began to write letters, some to her family, others to old friends, a few to the people she had worked with in India. They were not farewells so much as benedictions, short, graceful notes filled with gratitude and calm acceptance. To Louis, she wrote with tenderness, thanking him for his kindness and understanding. To her daughters, she spoke of love without sentimentality, urging them to live with courage. And to Nehru, she wrote only one line: "Remember, my dear friend, the river always finds the sea." By early 1957, her strength was almost gone. The doctors insisted she return to England. She refused. "If I must die," she said, "let it be near the river." Her final days were spent in a state of deep stillness, her window open to the sound of flowing water, the scent of jasmine drifting in the air. Nehru visited one last time, though he did not stay long. When he left her bedside, he paused at the door and looked back, just once. She smiled at him, that same steady, luminous smile he had seen so many times before, the smile that carried both farewell and forgiveness. And as the Ganges shimmered in the dusk, she whispered, not farewell, but gratitude, for having lived twice, once by duty, once by choice. Death, when it came for Edwina Mountbatten, arrived gently, as though the universe itself wished to spare her any further burden. She was in North Borneo, far from the polished corridors of London and the ceremonial weight of Delhi, on yet another humanitarian mission. The irony was both cruel and fitting. Even as her body faltered, she had continued her journey of service, unwilling to allow illness to tether her. The day was bright, the air heavy with tropical humidity. She'd spent the morning visiting a small hospital, speaking softly with local nurses, and later, at lunch, had laughed lightly with colleagues. That afternoon, she retired to her room for rest. When the maid entered some hours later, she was sitting in an armchair by the window, letters on her lap, the sea glimmering in the distance. Her heart, so immense in its giving, had simply stopped. The news spread swiftly, carried first by telegrams, then by the ripples of grief that seemed to cross continents. In Delhi, the sun had not yet set when the message reached the Prime Minister's residence. Nehru was in a meeting when an aide entered quietly, his expression grave. No words were needed. Nehru saw it in the man's eyes. For a long moment he did not speak. He simply placed his papers aside and stared through the open window into the garden, where the last light of day was fading. Then, without a word, he rose and left the room. That evening, he walked alone through the corridors of Teen Murdy House, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Those who saw him said that he looked like a man suddenly untethered from time. He said nothing to anyone until later, when he murmured, "She has gone home." In England, the reaction was swift and solemn. The newspapers that had once gossiped about her choices now printed tributes to her courage and compassion. Parliament observed a moment of silence. Even those who had judged her harshly could not deny the magnitude of her humanitarian legacy. The British royal family sent condolences. Her funeral was to be both private and national. Louis Mountbatten received the news with quiet devastation. For all the complexities of their marriage, Edwina had remained his dearest companion, the one constant presence in a life shaped by duty and danger. His grief was quiet but profound. "She was never mine to keep," he wrote to a friend, echoing words he had once said to her, "but she will always be the light by which I walked." In India, the mourning was different, less formal, more intimate. Nehru ordered the flag to fly at half-mast, an honor rarely bestowed upon a foreign national. Crowds gathered outside his residence, leaving flowers, photographs, notes of sympathy. The newspapers printed images of her visits to relief camps and hospitals, of her smiling beside refugees, of her hands touching those of the poor. The people called her Edwina Amma, Mother Edwina, a title of reverence reserved for those who had loved without measure. When Nehru addressed the nation that evening, his voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a lifetime of unshed tears. "She came to us as a stranger," he said softly, "and she left as one of our own." Her body was flown to London for the formal ceremonies, but her spirit seemed to linger elsewhere. In the streets she had walked, in the wards she had visited, in the lives she had touched. Nehru could not bring himself to attend the funeral. Instead, he retreated into silence, spending hours alone by the riverbank near Delhi, where the Yamuna flowed wide and slow beneath the dim blue sky. It was said that he carried a small photograph of her in his pocket for the rest of his life, its edges worn smooth from touch. The funeral itself was solemn, attended by royalty, statesmen, and the nameless multitudes she had helped. Her coffin was draped not only in the Union Jack, but also in a simple white cloth sent by Nehru, a gesture that moved even the most cynical observers. When the time came for the ashes to be scattered, Louis Mountbatten made an extraordinary decision. Half would be released into the waters off Portsmouth, in the cold gray sea of her homeland. The other half, according to her wish, would be taken to India, to be scattered at sea near the coast of Madras, where the warm tides of the Indian Ocean could carry her gently into eternity. That ceremony, quiet and unrecorded, became a legend. A small Indian naval vessel carried the urn out beyond the harbor, accompanied by a handful of sailors and a single priest. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the ashes were cast into the waves. For a moment they shimmered like silver dust before the sea absorbed them. On deck, one of the officers recited words from the Bhagavad Gita. For the soul, there is neither birth nor death. It is unborn, eternal, and everlasting. In that mingling of English reverence and Indian faith, her story found its most perfect conclusion. Nehru, though far away, marked the hour of the scattering in his own way. He stood at the window of his residence, facing south, where he knew the sea would lie beyond the plains. In his diary that evening, he wrote only a single line: "The waters have taken her, but they cannot take what she gave." Her passing did not end her influence. If anything, it deepened it. The institutions she had nurtured flourished. Her name became synonymous with selfless service. But her truest legacy lived not in plaques or buildings, but in the quiet transformation she had kindled in the hearts of those who knew her. For Louis, she had been the bridge between duty and forgiveness. For Nehru, she had been the embodiment of grace, the proof that love could exist without possession. For the countless ordinary people of India, she had been a living reminder that compassion could cross every boundary, class, race, and nation alike. And so it was that, at the meeting place of two seas, one cold and gray, the other warm and bright, Edwina Mountbatten found her rest, half of her ashes in the waters of her birth, half in the waters of her awakening. The tide that carried her belonged to neither Britain nor India, but to something vast enough to hold them both, the shared ocean of humanity. And thus the sea carried her home, to both shores, to both loves, to both histories she had gently altered. The years that followed Edwina Mountbatten's death unfolded like an echo slowly fading through the corridors of memory. The world, as it always does, continued its restless turning, but for those whose lives she had touched, something essential had gone still. In England, she was remembered with solemn gratitude, her name invoked at charity dinners and hospital inaugurations. Her portrait hung in quiet halls beside the plaques of benefactors, but her absence left a silence no commemoration could fill. Louis Mountbatten, ever dignified, resumed his public duties with the same composure that had defined his life, yet his eyes had acquired a distant melancholy, the kind that comes to those who have loved deeply and lost without protest. He spoke of her rarely, but when he did, it was with the measured reverence of a man recalling light that no longer burns, yet still warms. In India, the loss was felt more intimately, as though a fragment of the nation's own conscience had departed. The hospitals she had founded continued their work, their wards filled with the hum of life renewed, their nurses whispering stories about the lady who had once walked among them, unafraid of illness or exhaustion. Her photographs remained pinned to the walls of offices and clinics, faded but cherished. And in the villages where she had knelt in the dust beside the poor, people still spoke her name in the evenings, not as myth, but as memory. The generation that had witnessed the tumult of independence now carried her in their hearts as proof that compassion could survive even empire's end. For Jawaharlal Nehru, her passing marked the beginning of a quiet decline. Outwardly, he remained the formidable statesman, the architect of India's democracy, the voice of the newly independent world, but privately, a part of him had withered. Those close to him observed a new solitude about his manner, an introspective distance that neither family nor colleagues could bridge. He had always carried the loneliness of leadership, but now that loneliness had deepened into something more profound, the awareness that the one soul who had truly understood the weight he bore was gone. The rhythms of his day continued as before, the speeches, the cabinet meetings, the endless stream of letters, but within them was the faint pulse of weariness, a weariness that no accomplishment could relieve. There were times, in the years after her death, when he would travel to the places she had loved, the Red Cross centers, the refugee settlements, the flower gardens of Kashmir. He would move among the people quietly, pausing to listen, to ask after the sick or the poor, and those who had known her would greet him with a tenderness reserved for shared grief. They would speak of her in present tense, as if she still lingered nearby, and Nehru, rather than correct them, would nod and smile faintly, as though he, too, could still feel her presence in the warm air. Once, while visiting a hospital in Bombay, he paused before a portrait of her that hung near the entrance, a photograph of Edwina in her plain white sari, a stethoscope around her neck, her gaze both strong and serene. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, to those standing near, he murmured, "She was the best of us." His letters to friends became more reflective in tone. He wrote of impermanence, of the strange irony of living long enough to see one's dreams both fulfilled and forgotten. In one such letter, he confessed, "I have learned that love does not end with death. It changes form, it becomes air, memory, music. I hear her sometimes in the quiet, as one hears the echo of a bell long after it has ceased to ring." Those words, understated and unguarded, revealed more than any public statement ever could. By the early 1960s, age and illness had begun to overtake him. The vigor that had once carried him across continents was waning. In his final years, he often withdrew to his home in the foothills of the Himalayas, seeking solace in the vast silence of mountains that reminded him of eternity. Visitors recalled finding him sitting by the window, a shawl draped over his shoulders, a book, open but unread, in his lap. On the table beside him lay a small silver frame containing Edwina's photograph. It remained there until his final days. In May of 1964, Nehru's own life came quietly to its end. He died in his sleep, in the same house where he had written his most tender letters to her. The news of his passing cast a pall of sorrow across India. The nation wept for the man who had been its voice and its conscience. Yet among the many tributes that poured in from around the world, one in particular stood apart. From the deck of a British naval vessel stationed in the Indian Ocean, Lord Louis Mountbatten sent a message to the Indian government. In it, he wrote, "In mourning for him, we remember her. In remembering her, we honor what bound them both, the courage to love without asking the world's permission." Following Nehru's cremation, his ashes were divided and scattered, as he had wished, in the rivers and mountains of India. But one small urn, according to accounts whispered by those close to him, was taken to the sea near Madras, where Edwina's ashes had once been released. It was a private act, unrecorded, unannounced. A handful of officials and sailors stood by the rail as the urn was opened and its contents offered to the waves. The wind was warm, the sea calm. The waters closed gently over the ashes, uniting them once more in the quiet dance of the tide. Two lives that had begun worlds apart. She, the daughter of empire, he, the son of independence, had found in the end the same home, the infinite horizon where the boundaries of nations dissolve. They had lived not as legend or scandal, but as two human beings who dared to meet beyond the fences of history. Their bond had never been written into treaties, never sanctified by ceremony, yet it endured where so many alliances had failed. And so, the ripples of their lives moved outward through time, subtle but persistent. To some, they were a footnote in the story of empire's fall. To others, they were the first whisper of a new morality, a reminder that the heart, too, has a politics of its own. For the generation that followed, their story became a quiet parable about the possibility of grace in a century that had known so much cruelty. They were, as one writer later put it, proof that tenderness can be revolutionary. Two lives once divided by empire now rest united in dust and memory. History has a way of reshaping those who once lived vividly into the measured symbols of its own convenience. As the decades passed, the story of Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru drifted into that ambiguous realm between fact and fable, where affection becomes allegory and lives once warm to the touch harden into legend. The world changed, as worlds always do. The empire, whose shadow had once stretched over half the globe, became memory. The nations that had risen from its collapse found their own voices, their own disillusionments. Yet every so often, amid the noise of politics and the fever of modern ambition, their names would resurface. Two figures forever bound in that brief, incandescent intersection of love and history. In Britain, Edwina's image mellowed over time. The younger generations, unburdened by imperial pride, began to see her not as a symbol of colonial nostalgia, but as a woman ahead of her age. Biographers revisited her life with new eyes, peeling away the polite fictions of her class to uncover the raw humanity beneath. They wrote of her transformation, from socialite to servant of suffering, from dutiful wife to self-determined spirit. Documentaries spoke of her courage, her compassion, her improbable friendship with Nehru. In interviews, Louis Mountbatten's descendants spoke of her with warmth, even awe, acknowledging that she had lived more honestly than her world had allowed. She was, one of them said, the kind of woman the century wasn't ready for. In India, her legacy remained quieter, more personal. Her name lingered not in the corridors of government, but in the hearts of those who still remembered her kindness. Elderly nurses in hospitals told younger colleagues stories of Lady Edwina, who would arrive unannounced, sleeves rolled up, tending to the wounded without distinction of caste or creed. Old villagers remembered the Englishwoman who had stayed when all others left. Her photograph, yellowed and curling at the edges, could still be found in small clinics, tucked between devotional images, an unspoken acknowledgement that holiness sometimes wears unexpected faces. Jawaharlal Nehru's own image underwent its own metamorphosis. Revered, then criticized, then rediscovered, he became less a man than a mirror for the nation's shifting ideals. The India he had dreamed of was changing beyond recognition, modernizing, fragmenting, reaching toward the future with both pride and confusion. Yet in quieter moments, when scholars examined his letters or when his speeches were replayed in anniversary broadcasts, they would pause at the mention of her name. In those fragments of correspondence, private, luminous, aching with restraint, they found not scandal but poetry. To read them was to glimpse the soul of a man who had once believed that love could be as revolutionary as freedom. Historians argued endlessly about the nature of their bond. Some insisted it was purely platonic, others romantic, still others something unnameable. But the truest observers recognized that such questions missed the point. What mattered was not whether they had loved in the manner of lovers, but that they had loved in defiance of all that divided them: class, race, duty, and history itself. Their relationship stood as a quiet rebellion against the cynicism of their age, a reminder that tenderness, even when fleeting, has its own kind of endurance. As the century drew on, new generations discovered their story in fragments, in the margins of biographies, in half-remembered anecdotes, in fading photographs of two faces turned toward each other with quiet understanding. For those who looked closely, something in that gaze spoke across time. It suggested that beyond the noise of conquest and the cold machinery of politics, history's true measure might lie in moments of compassion, too subtle to record. The world they had inhabited vanished almost entirely by the end of the 20th century. The great houses of the British aristocracy fell into disrepair or became museums. The India they had known, raw, idealistic, wounded, grew into a global power, brilliant, yet divided. The very idea of empire became a relic, and with it the grandeur of duty that had once shaped Edwina's birthright. Yet even as the material remnants of their time faded, their story refused to disappear. It resurfaced in literature, in films, in whispered recollections. Playwrights found in them the drama of impossible love, historians the allegory of reconciliation, poets the melody of two hearts keeping time across continents. Some critics dismiss such retellings as romantic indulgence, but others, those who understood the frailty of human striving, saw in it something deeper. They saw that what bound Edwina and Nehru was not romance alone, but a profound moral kinship. Two people who, in the ruins of power, discovered the power of humility. In an age obsessed with dominance, they had practiced the quiet art of empathy. In the face of division, they had chosen connection. In the twilight of empire, they had dared to show that love itself could be a form of diplomacy. By the closing years of the millennium, their lives had become a mirror through which each generation re-examined its own conscience. To the old, they represented the possibility of redemption, that even those born into privilege could learn compassion. To the young, they symbolized freedom, the right to follow the call of the heart, no matter the constraints of society. And to historians, they remained a mystery that no archive could entirely solve, a story at once too intimate and too vast to be captured by fact alone. And perhaps that was their truest legacy. They taught the world that not all history is written in the language of power. Some of it is whispered in the vocabulary of grace. Every age that returned to them found not the same meaning, but the reflection of its own longing for dignity, for reconciliation, for a gentler way of being. In the end, time, that patient sculptor, did what it always does. It eroded the noise, polished the surfaces, and left behind only what endures. And when it came to the story of Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru, what endured was not the scandal of their affection, nor the politics of their nations, but the unyielding beauty of their humanity. In the end, it was not the power she wielded, but the tenderness she revealed that survived her century. There is a moment near the end of every great story when words begin to fall away and silence becomes the truest form of tribute. So it is with the tale of Edwina Mountbatten, a woman born into the grandeur of empire, who died belonging to no empire at all, only to love itself. And in the long years since her passing, as the world has spun onward through revolutions, technologies, and new confusions, her name continues to flicker quietly at the edge of memory, like a candle that refuses to go out. Time, that most impartial of judges, has softened her contradictions and left behind something luminous, a reminder that duty and desire, compassion and courage are not opposites, but mirrors that only the bravest among us learn to hold steady. It is easy, in retrospect, to see Edwina as a figure of destiny, her life shaped by history's grand machinery, her choices written into the slow collapse of an empire. But what truly marked her was not grandeur, but gentleness. Hers was a courage of intimacy, not conquest, the ability to sit beside the suffering without flinching, to defy the comfortable loyalties of her world in order to answer a higher call. When she followed her heart to India, she did not know she was stepping into legend. She simply refused to betray what she had come to understand as truth, that no flag, no title, no tradition could dictate the movements of the human soul. And yet she was no idealized saint. Her life was messy, contradictory, and human. She could be impatient, proud, even reckless. But perhaps it is this very humanity that makes her story endure. For she was not perfection embodied, but transformation itself, a woman who began as a symbol of hierarchy and ended as its quiet undoing. In her love for Nehru, the last great statesman poet of his generation, she found not passion's fever, but compassion stillness, the serenity that comes when two lives recognize each other beyond the illusions of culture and creed. Their love did not need to conquer, it needed only to understand, and in that understanding, both were changed. If one listens carefully, one can still feel the rhythm of that change in the world they left behind. In the streets of Delhi, where once her footsteps echoed through refugee camps, now rise hospitals and schools that bear her touch in spirit, if not in name. In the archives of London, among papers yellowed by decades, lie the letters she wrote in moments of exhaustion and grace, letters filled not with grandeur, but with the simple clarity of a soul at peace with its purpose. And somewhere, in the eternal murmur of the sea, her ashes still drift between two shores that once called themselves opposites, now joined by the tide that knows no border. The empire she served and outgrew has long vanished, its certainties dissolved into the plural, restless fabric of the modern world. Yet something of her spirit remains wherever people choose empathy over indifference, tenderness over pride. To follow one's heart in defiance of power, this in every century is an act of quiet revolution. Edwina's rebellion was not shouted from podiums or carved in stone. It was whispered in acts of care, in the refusal to turn away from suffering, in the simple courage to love without asking what the world would think. She left behind no manifesto, only an example. But examples, like seeds, have a way of blooming long after the gardener is gone. And what of Nehru, her kindred spirit across the gulf of history? He too has become an image, a name in textbooks, a voice in recordings, but behind all that formality still lingers the trace of a man who, in a rare and unguarded moment, once wrote, "We were not bound by promise, yet we were never free of each other." Because perhaps that line, simple and sorrowful, captures the essence of what they shared, the understanding that love's truest form is not ownership, but recognition. Their union was not of bodies or of nations, but of two consciences daring to meet in the open. As I look back across the years of their intertwined lives, I find myself wondering whether history, with all its grandeur and cruelty, is nothing more than the story of hearts learning to recognize one another across impossible divides. Perhaps that is what the lives of Edwina and Nehru teach us, that even in an age of collapsing certainties, there remains within the human spirit an unquenchable tenderness that refuses to yield. The world may measure progress by conquest and invention, but the heart measures it by empathy, the courage to see another not as subject or stranger, but as self. And so, when we ask what might have happened had Edwina Mountbatten not followed her heart, but her duty, we glimpse only a shadow of what truly did happen. For in following her heart, she not only changed the course of her own life, but offered history a rare glimpse of its better self. Her choice did not alter maps or governments, but it altered the rhythm of human possibility. She showed that love, when freed from possession, becomes not weakness but wisdom, the bridge between what we are and what we might yet become. The years will continue to pass, names will fade, empires will crumble, and even the memories of those who once lived with such intensity will soften into dust. But every now and then, in the quiet hours of reflection, when the noise of the world subsides, we might still hear the faint sound of waves, the same waves that carried her ashes, that touched two continents, that murmured the eternal song of reunion. And in that sound, we may remember that while power divides, love gathers, that while duty ends, compassion endures, that while the heart may break, it is through that breaking that it finally learns to see. And so, dear listener, we close this imagined chapter with a single truth, that love, when chosen freely, alters not only lives, but the very rhythm of time itself.